starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest? Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Really? A program on Catholic radio and television for non-Catholics? Yes, indeed. We know you're out there. We know that you listen to this program. Perhaps you watch it on TV sometimes and you're thinking, well, you know, I used to be a Catholic, but I'm not Catholic now anymore, but I do have some questions. We'd love to talk with you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 if you have a question for us, or if you'd just like to say, well, here's why I'm not a Catholic. What's keeping you from becoming a Catholic? Again, the number 833-288-3986. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Again, the phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Michael Birchfield is our producer. Ryan Penny is our phone screener. And Jeff Burson is on social media. He will be glad to pass on any questions you might want to pose via YouTube or Facebook. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how you getting along today?
Couldn't be better. How about you, my friend?
I'm doing pretty decent. I just came to the network straight from a meeting about the Birmingham Eucharistic Congress, June 28th, 29th, in case you don't know about it.
Yes.
If you're in the neighborhood, heck, if you're not in the neighborhood, put June 28th and 29th, Birmingham, Alabama, Jefferson County Civic Center on your calendar, and come out and see great speakers, hear great speakers like Scott Hahn and Pedro Nunez, Father Pedro Nunez, David Melanie Owens, many other great Catholic luminaries to encourage you in your faith. Meet brothers and sisters and religious, and EWTN Religious Catalog is going to be there, along with a lot of other vendors. It's just going to be a great Catholic expo and big shindig celebrating 50 years of Catholic life in Birmingham, Alabama. So
looking forward to it. And you're going to be there?
I'm going to be there, yep.
Excellente. All right. We're going to lead off here with an email from Joe who says, does the Catholic Church permit donation of one's organs after they die?
Only after you die, right?
I would hope so.
Except, well, obviously you can give a kidney away and still stay alive. But yes, you can donate organs. That's fine, provided that you don't do anything to hasten death. That sort of thing. So,
sure.
Yes.
Okay. And here's one from Dominic. To get a better understanding of Luther and Calvin, what book or books would you recommend? Also, is your doctoral thesis on Calvin available online, perhaps?
Okay, thank you. So on Luther, there are many, many wonderful resources on Luther, and I would recommend Luther, Man Between God and the Devil by Heiko Obermann. Obermann was himself a Dutch Reform scholar, historian, but a great scholar of Luther, and that's a wonderful cultural, intellectual biography of Luther. It really sets him in his late medieval context. It's probably my favorite work on Luther.
Okay.
When it comes to Calvin, again, there are many, many works on Calvin. I like the book The Young Calvin by Alexandre Ganoche. And it doesn't look anything like it's spelled. It looks like Ganuksky.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
But Alexander Ganoche, who was a Hungarian French priest, Catholic priest, but sympathetic to Calvin. And he's a great Calvin scholar. He does the same thing for Calvin that Obermann does for Luther. So The Young Calvin by Alexander Ganoche and Luther, Man Between God and the Devil by Heiko Obermann. My doctoral dissertation on Calvin is available. It's a little bit tricky to get hold of it. You have to actually buy the dissertation. It's not been published as a book. And you can do that. There is ProQuest dissertation services will distribute either a print copy to you or bound copy, unbound copy, a number of different formats that you can get it from ProQuest dissertation services.
Oh, very good. Thank you for that. And here is an email from Eleanor. Would you please clarify for me what the requirements for marriage would be under the following circumstances? Two non-Catholic Christians, a male and a female, are married by their pastor in a religious ceremony. They are subsequently divorced civilly. They get a civil divorce. Now, a practicing Catholic wants to marry one of those original divorced parties.
Okay, thanks. So the Catholic Church would regard the marriage of two non-Catholic Christians as presumptively valid.
Okay.
We presume the validity, and they are capable of contracting a sacramental marriage, and they do not have to maintain canonical form because they're not Catholics, and so just in virtue of their baptism, their marriage could be sacramental, and in virtue of being alive, any two people who can be married can contract a natural valid marriage. So since the Church regards that as presumptively valid, one of those people, well, the one that had previously married or would presume to have been married, would need to obtain an annulment, a judgment by the Church that they in fact were not married, in order to be eligible to marry at all, right?
Okay, very good. And we just received a quick question here from Isabel, watching us today on Facebook. Can you have a Mass for your loved one after they are cremated?
Oh, of course. Yeah, thank you very much. So, we offer the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass for the repose of the soul, and the soul is going to benefit from the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, whether your remains are cremated or not.
Okay, very good. And here's a question now from Peter. This may take a bit of time on Facebook, and it's really only 5 words. What does the altar represent?
The altar in the Bible or the altar in a church?
Doesn't say.
Well, an altar is a table of sacrifice. So it doesn't represent anything. It is what it is. It is the space on which you offer a sacrifice. In the Old Testament sacrificial system, the animal would be slaughtered on an altar, all right, and then burned and consumed. In the New Testament church and the Catholic Church, the Eucharist is consecrated on an altar of sacrifice, and then offered in sacrifice to God.
Okay, very good. Well, we've got quite a bit more of the show coming up, and we are delighted to be here with you here today on EWTN's Call to Communion. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're watching us today on TV, well, you can participate as well by sending us an email to ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. And, of course, all the other ways to contact the show that we mentioned up at the top, when that would be texting and our Twitter handle @EWTN Radio, or perhaps YouTube, Facebook, lots of ways you can get in touch with us. Let us know why you're not a Catholic. What is keeping you from becoming a Catholic? Again, our phone number, 833-288-EWTN, here on Call to Communion. Stay with us.
I am Father Thomas Loya, and this week on Light of the East on EWTN, it was providential that women were the first to hear the news of Christ's resurrection. In examples of the myrrh-bearing women, together with Joseph of Arimathea, who buried Christ's body, we all are called to examine our own relationship to the body of Christ. On EWTN, Sundays at 11:30 a.m. Eastern.
60 on 10 with Monsignor Charles Pope.
The 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. At one level, the reputation a person has is one of their most precious gifts, and to intentionally harm the good reputation of someone is a very grave matter. We can do this often through detraction by disclosing others' faults without a valid reason, or calumny, just outright lying about other people. Likewise, through rash judgment. This commandment also protects the truth, which is another very, very great good. To lie is to speak something that we know is false with the intention of deceiving others. We ought to be dedicated to the truth. It is the truth that sets people free, while errors and lies entrap people in many difficult and often sinful situations. The Lord asks us to give witness to the truth of the gospel. This commandment therefore asks us to stay dedicated to the truth and to other people's reputation. The 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
It's EWTN Radio's Call to Communion. Glad that you're with us today. Dr. David Anders here to answer your questions about the Catholic faith, and perhaps to have a little chat about what's keeping you from becoming a Catholic. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833 288-3986. Dan sent us an email. Could you please explain why all of humanity has been held accountable in the form of original sin by the sins of our first parents, Adam and Eve? Why would a just and merciful God hold all of humanity responsible for a sin that was committed by someone else? Also, is it possible that if our original parents had been a different couple, say Steve and Barbara, sin would have never entered the world?
Okay, thanks. So it depends on the manner in which you imagine God to hold us responsible. That's a very important point to get to. So original sin is not imputed to us as if we ourselves had actually sinned. All right, that's a very important point. So it's not like God on the day of judgment would look at a newly conceived zygote embryo that had never done anything in its entire life and say, "You wicked zygote, I'm going to punish you eternally for the sin of Adam and Eve." It doesn't work that way.
Okay.
Now, that is, however, the way many Calvinist Protestants think that it works. I mean, that was a common belief among the Puritans that, that they thought that even a miscarried child would just drop straight into the pit of hell and be there in agony for all eternity, and that was just. Well, that's kind of absurd, and we Catholics think that that's absurd and have never held that. And medieval theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas understood that was unjust, and so we formulated our doctrine of original sin accordingly, right? Qualified the way in which we are or are not responsible for Adam's sin, but also thought about what the afterlife must entail, or what that must entail for the afterlife. So Thomas, for one, said because infants have never done any actual sin, nothing good or bad for which they can be accountable, those who die without baptism, he thought, would probably go to limbo, a place of purely natural happiness that's not quite the beatific vision, but it's certainly not hell. It's more like eternity in a Caribbean golf club or something. All right. Now, limbo is not a doctrine of the Church. It's not a dogma of the Church, and you don't have to hold it. And many Catholics today do not believe in the existence of limbo. I just bring that up to illustrate how Catholics have thought about this issue. Okay. Catechism of the Catholic Church says that original sin is sin in an analogous manner only. It's not as if we ourselves had sinned. What it really means is that we come into the world without the gift of sanctifying grace. Unlike the Blessed Virgin Mary, who was created with sanctifying grace, when we are born, we're conceived, and when we're born, we stand in need of God's grace if we wish to enjoy eternal life. But guess what? He offers grace to everyone. To everyone. Even if you haven't explicitly heard the gospel, God still makes the offer of grace to everyone and makes it possible for everyone to be saved. So the dilemma that you're coming up with doesn't really exist. Now, you could still say, okay, so why does God create a world in which he knows that people will come into existence without grace and need to choose him and need to battle against sin, need to overcome their vices and rely on his grace to enter into a relationship with him? Why couldn't he just create a race of angels? Well, we've kind of already answered the question by outlining the conditions. It is good that there be a world in which rational creatures have an opportunity to reach out for God and find him, as St. Paul talks about in Acts chapter 17. Jesus says there's more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner that repents than over 99 righteous people that have no need of repentance. How many times have you watched a movie about a hero who was born without any problems in a perfect world with no challenges, and then lives out his days in happiness and peace on a beach, and then dies and goes to heaven?
Wouldn't be much of a movie.
Boring story, right?
Yeah.
That's the heroism of the thing is precisely his struggling against massive odds and then overcoming.
Right.
And the same thing is true about the narrative of our own lives, that God does give us the opportunity to struggle, but also so that we can merit, so that we can do things that are admirable and noble and worthy of recognition by God. And in the end, our lot will be better than that of the angels. They also had an opportunity to sin or not sin, but nothing like the kind of opportunity that we have on a daily basis to struggle against vice and concupiscence and pride, rely on God's grace, and grow and develop over time into the likeness of Jesus, and then be rewarded eternally.
Dan, thank you so much for your email. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-283-1037, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We begin here with Joel in Pensacola, Florida, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Hey, Joel, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I was just wondering, I have some Baptist friends who were talking about the end times prophecies and Revelation, the book of Revelations. What is our Catholic view on that?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So what is a dogmatic fact is that Christ will come again. He will judge the living and the dead. He will raise the dead and judge them for their deeds in their bodies. And I like to tell people we're closer now than we've ever been. No man knows the day or the hour. Could come tomorrow. For all we know, maybe we're in the early church right now. We've just completed 2,000 of the first 200 million that we have to. We don't know. We don't know. All right. So when you look at the apocalyptic texts of the New Testament, in particular, book of Revelation, there's obviously an awful lot of symbolic language there, and interpreters have for a long time read that text and tried to apply it to their own day. And it's interesting how they have been both remarkably successful and unsuccessful at the same time. Everyone who picks up the book and reads it will say, oh yeah, that sounds like today. Well, this crazy guy with 7 horns, that must be XYZ political figure or guy I don't like, right? That sounds like today. But the problem is every generation has that response.
Sure it does.
And that's kind of the point of apocalyptic texts. There is a perennial value to them, and we see these are types and allegories of human experience that we see repeated in every age. The beast from the earth and the beast from the sea that we read about in Revelation characterize corrupt religious and political power. Well, that's never happened before. No, you see all these things happen constantly. And so we look into these texts and we find a picture of our own contemporary society and perhaps even of ourselves, and are confronted with the reality of Christ's judgment. Now, my own personal view, and this of course is just me, is that the sacred writer draws direct parallels to events that were contemporaneous with him, figures from first century Judean and Roman history. Okay. And he names them in symbolic ways, like the 666, most interpreters think is pretty clearly a reference to Nero Caesar, who definitely was a type of Antichrist. But do we get involved in the date setting and it's this guy and it's that guy? No, we don't. And it's interesting. Pope John the 22nd, 14th century Pope, Avignon Pope. Not a great guy, John the 22nd. Not a great guy. Definitely doesn't go down in the annals of Catholic history as one of the shining exemplars of papal purity. But he dealt with a lot of this in his own day. And guess who a lot of his contemporaries were pegging for Antichrist? John the 22nd, right?
No surprise, yeah.
And he was like, don't like that very much.
Yeah.
Interestingly, best thing he ever did, in my judgment, was canonize Thomas Aquinas. So that's kind of the story. Now, when you look at Matthew 24, which is another one of these sort of end times apocalyptic passages, Jesus seems to locate it pretty definitely within the first century. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, wars, rumors of wars, then run for the hills because the end is nigh. And so one way of reading that would be to say, well, clearly Christ predicts the historical fall of the city of Jerusalem to the Romans in 70 A.D., but also finds in that a kind of a type or a sort of an allegory for these kinds of experiences that recur for the church in every age.
Okay. Hey, Joel, we hope that's helpful for you. Thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you now, 833-288-EWTN, if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or if you'd just like to share why you're not a Catholic. We would love to talk about that. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Let's go to Julia now in Tacoma, Washington, checking us out today on Sirius XM 130. Julia, what's on your mind today?
Well, I recently completed my RCIA, and I felt like the class that I attended was really poorly executed, and I studied a lot. I took a lot of information into my head, not as much experience into my heart, but I tried to connect as much as I could throughout the class and praying the rosary and such and connecting with the community. But what weighs heavy on my mind is the sin, and having been of the world for nearly 50 years and sinning and still sinning, and it seemed to be taken too lightly in the instruction that I was given, and I just don't know how to approach it, and I don't know if I'm being too hard on myself. I just don't know how to move forward, but I won't take communion without completing it.
Oh, sure. Thanks. I really appreciate the question. Great question, in fact. And I think the saints are going to be a really great help to you here. And if you've never familiarized yourself with Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo, 4th century saint and doctor and theologian of the Church, his autobiography, The Confessions, is the story of a man who was absolutely weighed down with his own consciousness of sin and of the deep struggles that he had in finally arriving at Catholic baptism, and then the incredible relief that he experienced and the joy that followed that. I really strongly recommend you take a peek at the life of St. Augustine. I don't know if you've been baptized or not, but if you have not been baptized, then if you were to receive baptism, everything you've done in the past is remitted completely in baptism. If you are baptized, and it's just a matter of being a candidate for confirmation, you will go to confession before your First Holy Communion. Same thing. The guilt of all your sin will be remitted in the confessional, and you'll be given an opportunity to do penance, right, for the satisfaction that you need to make for temporal sin. That's what the Church has provided to deal with past sin. And so if you take those steps, either submit yourself to baptism or to the sacrament of penance, then that's why you have the confidence to go worthily to communion. Now, your intuition that I ought not to go to communion unworthily, that's true. That is absolutely true. But the Church has made a way for you, an easy way. And the way is either baptism in the case of a catechumen, or penance, confession, absolution in the case of a candidate for confirmation. And when you go to confession, the priest will say to you, I absolve you of your sins. And, I mean, we're not just whistling Dixie here. Jesus said to the priest, whoever sins you forgive are forgiven. And part of the act of faith is to believe that when those words are pronounced, in your case, that they are true. To have faith that that has taken place. Now, what you can't get rid of by the confessional is the memory of sin. You can't get rid of sometimes the effects of sin. I remember reading one time about a guitarist for Jimi Hendrix who took drugs and cut off 3 of his fingers because he wanted to play guitar like Django Reinhardt.
Wow.
And when he came to, he was like, what an idiot I am. I don't have 3 fingers. They didn't grow back because of his remorse,
sure.
Right? So sometimes we can impose consequences on ourselves because of our irrational actions that we call sins. Those consequences may not be remitted in the confessional. I can't regrow 3 fingers on my hand. And I might not forget the memories of what I have done. But those things become to us goads for future holiness. And the saints are not remitted of those things either. I mean, St. Francis of Assisi, who is reputed to be probably the holiest person in the Western Church after the Blessed Virgin Mary, wept for his sins to the last day of his life. Not for his present sins, but for his past sins. Because he realized what an opportunity he'd had in the first 20 whatever years of his life that he squandered. And he made up for lost time something good.
Yes, he did.
But he regretted those first 20 years. And that's not a bad attitude, It's not an unjust attitude to have remorse or to mourn those lost opportunities from our early life when we did things we regret. But those things no longer stand as barriers or impediments between us and relationship with our loving God and Father.
They should not consume us. They should not.
No, they certainly shouldn't consume you. Yeah,
absolutely. Julia, thank you so much for your call. Went to confession last night. There was something that was bothering me, has bothered me for maybe 3 or 4 days now, and I thought, well, let's just make sure. I explained it to the priest, and was absolved of that sin. Did the penance, and as we've always taught our dogs, if you don't want the dog to pick this thing up, you just say, leave it leave it. And if you try, so I'm just saying, leave it. It's done. It's confessed. Let that thing go.
You gotcha.
All right. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. One real quick question here before we go to break. This is from Tom. I've heard all Catholics are Christians, but not all Christians are Catholics. Is this true, and what differences exist between them?
The question is, all Catholics are Christian, but all Christians are not Catholics.
That's correct.
That true?
That's correct.
That is correct, right? Mm-hmm. To be a Christian is to be a baptized follower of Christ. To be a Catholic is to be a baptized follower of Christ who holds to everything that Jesus taught by way of Scripture or sacred tradition and adheres to the authority that Christ instituted, which is the Catholic Church, in union with all the Catholic Christians throughout the world.
Tom, thanks so much for your question via Facebook. Lots more straight ahead here on this edition of Called to Communion on EWTN. Stay with us.
Jimmy Akin.
One of my greatest joys in life is the joy of discovery, especially discovering answers to the questions about God, about the world that He's made, and how we can find our way to Him.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
I'm Evangelist Alveda, King of Priest for Life with Pro-Life Update. The elections of 2020 are well underway. They will determine, among other things, the direction in which our nation's federal courts will go. The President nominates these judges, not just for the Supreme Court, but for the district and appellate courts, and the U.S. Senate confirms them. Starting now, we need to know where candidates for President and U.S. Senate stand on judges. Do they believe they are bound by the text of the law and the Constitution and by principles like the sanctity of life and religious freedom? Now is the time to ask these questions. Find out if there will be a U.S. Senate race in your state, and if so, whether your current senator plans to run again. The process of being an informed voter in 2020 starts now. I'm Evangelist Alveda King on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
EWTN, teaching the truth.
You have just a beautiful compassion and an affirmation of every caller. You zone right in to each person's need, and then you ask all of us to pray for that person, and I do. I just think you really, really have a great ministry. You just really are tonic and concentrated multiple vitamins for all of us spiritually.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
For better or worse,
till death do us part.
We're discussing living your marriage vows on tomorrow's Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
Now let's return to more of
Back to the phones on this edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. Let's go to Jason in Lincoln, Nebraska, listening on the Great Spirit Catholic Radio, longtime partner with EWTN. Hey, Jason, what's on your mind today?
Just calling in, just looking for proof or evidence of the Creator. Just wondering what answer you have for me.
Oh, thanks. Is there evidence for the existence of the Creator? Sure. Well, the Catholic understanding of God is that, it's our definition, right, is that God is the first principle. God is the first principle. Let me explain what that means. If you are in the discipline of geometry, the principles are the axioms. These are the foundational bedrock truths from which all the demonstrations will flow. All right, and there are principles that underlie the continuing existence of the coffee cup that I'm holding in my hand right now, like chemical bonds and laws of physics and so forth. And so we can look for principles in all sorts of domains of reality. But does reality as such have a principle? Is there a ground of its intelligibility? And everything in our experience presumes that there is. I mean, you can look at science, you can look at philosophy, you can look at veterinary medicine, for crying out loud. And in every one of our intentional acts, our human acts, we proceed through this world, this universe, as if things make sense, that they have explanations that are discoverable, and that forms the basis of our rational behavior, right, as human beings. And the Catholic simply says that, yeah, the whole show is like that. Well, what's true of the coffee cup, what's true of the geometric demonstration, what's true of the vet trying to figure out what's wrong with the sick dog and fix it, is true of the whole show, all right? And let me make another analogy. If you're walking through the forest and you come across a glowing orb, you don't just say, oh, a glowing orb. It must be here unintelligibly and without reason. No, your first response was, what is it and where did it come from?
Yeah.
All right? And if you blow the orb up so that it is the size of the Empire State Building, the problem of explaining the orb does not shrink, it gets proportionately bigger. Now just keep blowing that orb up bigger and bigger and bigger until it is coextensive with the dimensions of the space-time universe. You haven't just eliminated the problem. You've just made it even bigger, right? And the Catholic Church doesn't say that we know much at all about the character of that first cause, not so much what it is, as simply that it is, right? As to God's essence or nature. And God, of course, is just the word we give, the word we assign to whatever there is to say about such a first cause. That's just what we're calling God, right? But we profess a great deal of ignorance about the inner nature or essence of that thing. We can draw a few conclusions about its nature or essence. One of them is that whatever that thing is, it can't be something that's composite, built out of parts. Because composite things, their composition stands also in need of explanation. There's something in virtue of which they are composed. This book that I'm holding in my hand, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, is a composition. It consists of a number of different pages. And there are principles that underlie its composition, namely authorial intent, editor's work, the glue, the ink, there are principles that can account for it. All right. So the composite things need an explanation for their composition. If there is something that underlies the composite, then that's just what we mean by the first cause, you see. So it can't be something that's composite, which means it also can't be something that's material, because material things are always composite. And it can't be something that's subject to change, all right, because changeable things change in virtue of something that changes them. All right? And if there was something in virtue of which it could change, then that would just be the first cause. So it's a simple thing. It's an impassable thing. And similarly, it can't be something temporal, because temporality is itself a kind of change, a kind of mobility. So it's beyond time. And also, physics kind of fleshes this out a little bit as we see the ways in which time and space are intrinsically connected, and you can't really have one without the other. So we're really looking at something that has no body, has no spatial dimension, has no physicality, no capacity to change, doesn't exist in time, and yet stands as an explanatory cause, a principle in virtue of which other things exist. Now, one thing that we don't say, all right, Catholics believe on faith that the world had a beginning in time. But we don't say that you have to believe that's philosophically demonstrable. So if you say, well, look, I believe there may be such a principle, but it's coextensive with the universe, or it's co-eternal, I should say, with the universe. The universe has always been there in virtue of whatever that underlying principle is. Catholic Church says, yeah, that's a reasonable philosophical position to hold, all right? That the eternity of the world is something that philosophers could potentially hold. Now, there may be reasons not to hold it. It doesn't conflict with what we mean by God. Now, we hold on faith that the world had a beginning in time, but I can't prove that to you philosophically. I'd have to prove that to you from revelation. And now we're just talking about what we can hold philosophically. Well, maybe you come back to me and say, well, Anders, I just don't think reality works that way. I just think that there are brute facts. There are things that are unintelligible. There are things that don't make sense and don't have causes. Well, okay, that's fine. I wonder what the likelihood is that the Easter Bunny is suddenly going to appear on the middle of my desk for absolutely no reason. Okay, well, are you asserting that the universe is of that sort? It's the sort where unintelligible brute facts can just happen, can just occur, for literally and absolutely no reason. And could you ever, in principle, know that to be the case? You really couldn't. There's no way actually to identify the existence of an uncaused event, an uncaused effect, because all we can ever perceive is the effect.
Right.
We can reason to a cause, but we perceive the effect. And the best you could do is say, here's something that happened for which I don't yet have a good explanation. But there's no way rationally to say, and therefore I know that there is no explanation. There's no way to know that. That's just an assertion. It's a dogmatic assertion because you don't like the conclusion that reality is intelligible. But let's say that you go there. You're willing to bite the bullet, and you say, well, I just think reality is absurd. It has no explanation. There's no coherence to it. Things just happen, and rationality can't grasp that because there's nothing to grasp. Okay, well, you can say that, but at what cost? Well, you've got to throw out science. That's certainly not a scientific position to take, because science is based entirely on the premise that reality is intelligible, and that it's sort of uniformly and coherently intelligible, so that if I discover something in physics, it's not going to contradict something that I discover in chemistry. And if somebody asserts something in biology that conflicts with what I know about geology, well, it can't be true, right? There's a kind of consistency that runs, a thread that runs through the whole show.
Sure.
And Catholics go, yeah, sounds good to us. So in a sense, the debate between theists and atheists is not so much a debate about whether or not there is some object in addition to the space-time universe called God. And in fact, Catholics really don't believe that God is an object of that sort. Right? God is not a being among beings. He doesn't fall in a genus. Okay, it's really a debate about the nature of explanation as to whether or not you think that our explanatory faculties cohere with reality, or whether they are just absurd. So, you want to go with absurd? I guess you could claim to be the Easter Bunny popping on my desk if you want.
Probably not, though. Hey, Jason, that was a great call.
But,
Yes.
Last thing.
Yeah, okay.
That's just a brief touch of some of the arguments for the existence of God. To elaborate on those, I'm going to give you a couple of books.
Oh, very good.
Or suggest a couple of books.
Sure.
One of them is a recent book by Edward Feser, F-E-S-E-R, called 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. Another one, really one of my favorites, is by an Eastern Orthodox theologian named David Bentley Hart. It's simply called The Experience of God. Those 2 books, great introductions to this topic.
Very good. A couple of good resources for you, Jason. Thanks so much for your call today from Lincoln, Nebraska. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go now to Bob in Tiffin, Ohio, listening on St. John Paul the Great Catholic Radio. Hello, Bob. What's on your mind today?
A little information, please, about God's will in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. 2822 speaks of it, and to love one another, and how that compare and contrast, and does the Catechism have it right when we are to love one another rather than to love our neighbor as ourselves, and that Jesus is the model?
Okay, let me read paragraph 2822 of the Catechism. Our Father desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. He is forbearing towards you, not wishing that any should perish. His commandment is that you should love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And the citation there is from the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verse 34. This commandment summarizes all the others and expresses his entire will. So obviously the Catechism means this expresses his entire will with regard to humans' treatment one of the other. I mean, the command to love God, of course, not explicitly mentioned, but that's also part of the revelation. So I'm not quite sure if I understand your question. You contrasted this command with another command of Christ that we should love our neighbor, and I'm not quite sure I see the distinction between loving one another and loving my neighbor. I think they both essentially name the same reality.
Okay. Bob, thank you so much for your call. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Got a question here from Sharon via Facebook. We were talking earlier about what is keeping you from becoming a Catholic. Sharon says, what has made me fall away from the church is the feeling that EWTN and the church have endorsed certain political candidates. And I want to speak to that for just a second, if I could. EWTN doesn't promote or endorse any candidates for any office. We don't endorse or promote any political office or political party. We don't do that. We don't do it because we don't want to do it and we can't do it. So that is just now. Maybe you could speak a little about what the church teaches.
Yeah, sure. And I'd like to speak anecdotally a little bit also as my experience as a Catholic. I have wonderful Catholic friends who disagree with my politics entirely.
Okay.
And we are on completely opposite sides of political issues.
Me too.
That's one of the most brilliant things about being a Catholic. Because I know some non-Catholic religious institutions where if you disagree on politics, you're shown the door, down to the congregation down the street where you can, flock with birds of a feather.
Yeah.
Right? That's not how the Catholic Church works. We actually open our doors to everybody. Catholics are human beings, and so they have political opinions. But we don't show you to the door because you have a different political opinion from your priest or from the guy in the pew next to you. And Jesus teaches that his kingdom is not of this world. When Pilate asked, "Are you a king?" Jesus says, "Yeah, I'm a king, but my kingdom is not of this world." When Pope Benedict was speaking to the Bundestag in Germany, their parliamentary representatives, he made the point that the Catholic Church, unlike some world religions, has never sought to impose a juridical political order as if it were derived from revelation, to say, this form of government is the only one or the best one or the one that everybody has to adhere to. And Catholic churches and Catholic civilizations have been formed around the ideal of monarchy, around democracy, around various other forms of government. And in all of them, it's possible to live a Catholic life and have a Catholic body politic. It's probably not possible to have a sort of civil order that's organized on Catholic principles if the nation-state explicitly rejects the existence of God, like in the communist systems. But it's compatible with a lot of different political forms. And of course, Catholic thought on these issues has changed as society changes in one culture or another. And so you're certainly not obligated as a Catholic to hold a particular ideology. And now it's perfectly reasonable to have an opinion on political ideology, but this is not the substance or the essence of our faith.
Right.
But let's say you meet a Catholic who is so persuaded that their particular political ideology is the only plausible interpretation of the biblical data or the scriptural data or the social realities. What do? You pat that person on the back, hand them a cup of coffee, and wish them a good day.
Very good. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Glad you're with us. You can always email the show, by the way, by writing to ctc@ewtn.com. If you've got a great question, you'd like to share it, but maybe it's 10 o'clock at night. We're not on the air at 10 o'clock at night. However, you could always send that email to ctc@ewtn.com. Here's a question from David via YouTube. How come when St. Paul wrote his epistle to the Catholic Church, that is Romans, he never mentioned St. Peter or the papacy?
Well, because the reason he wrote the book of Romans was to answer a very specific theological question, and that is, what is the relationship of the Gentile church to the Jewish believers? That was what motivated the letter. So he wasn't writing a book of ecclesiology. Also, and I'm going to display my own ignorance here, and some biblical scholars out there that know the biographical data on Paul better than I do can enlighten me. I'm not sure what the dating of Romans was relative to Peter's own move to Rome, right? I'm kind of thinking that this is before Peter moved to Rome, but I'm not entirely sure on that. I mean, Peter and Paul both ended their lives by martyrdom under Nero. But it's entirely possible Peter might still have been in Antioch at that time. I'm not sure.
Okay, very good. Here now is Peter in Worcester, Mass., listening on Emmanuel Radio, one of our great radio partners there. Peter, what's on your mind today?
Hello there.
Hi.
I'm saying on the topic of faith versus works, in any faith gathering that I have ever attended, the first requirement of its participants was assent to the orthodoxies of that religion. That would include Catholics, where one is required to believe all defined dogmas. Would that assent be a work, or is it faith?
Sure, absolutely, it's a work. Hands down, no doubt it's a work. To assent to what God has revealed is an act of the intellect as commanded by the will. So it's volitional. And it's meritorious, because we are asked to assent to things that we cannot, in principle, know to be true through rational means alone. All right? That's why God regarded Abraham's faith as meritorious. God said, "You are righteous because you've done these things." God said to Abraham, "Abraham, get up, leave Ur of the Chaldeans, go to the land I will show you. I'll make your name great, give you a lot of descendants. They'll be a blessing to the whole world." Abraham could have said, "Doesn't sound like a pretty good deal, God. I'm not so sure you'll deliver. I'm going to sit right here in Ur of the Chaldees and spend out my days." But instead, Abraham said, "All right, God said it. It's going to happen. I'm going to do it." Up he hops. Off he goes to the promised land, or on his way. All right, ends up down in Egypt. And God said, "Oh, he listened. He believed what I said. He went off and did it. That's meritorious. Credit it to him as righteousness." Genesis 15:6 says that. Think of an analogy. My wife calls me up. She says, "Dave, I can't pick up the child at his school at the end of the school day. When the bell rings, I'm not going to be there. I need you to go get my child, our child." All right? And I'm like, "That's not very convenient. I got a radio show to do. I got to go back to the diocese and go to yet another business meeting.
Yeah.
You know, I got other things on my plate. I don't want to make those sacrifices. I think I'm going to sit right here." And then the kid's languishing in after daycare, right? And I get home and I get an earful for not picking the kid up. But what if I say, "Okay, I'll rearrange my day, reschedule my meeting, make that sacrifice," and I go? Based on what did I make that determination? The reliability of my wife.
Of course.
Right? That she was actually speaking truth to me, that the kid really needed to be picked up, and then I acted accordingly. That's why faith is meritorious. It absolutely is a work, and it requires work to follow through. So I know the question was premised on a alleged division or dichotomy between faith and works, and I think that may misstate a biblical teaching. When St. Paul contrasts justification by faith and justification by works of the law, he's not interested in whether or not we have to do things or whether or not moral behavior is required of us to be saved. He takes it as a matter of course that we have to do moral behaviors in order to be saved. He's really interested in the question of whether or not Gentiles have to follow the Mosaic law, whether they have to circumcise their children or follow the laws of kashrut in their eating, or whether they have to separate from the world in the same kind of ritual ways that Jews would have done. And he says emphatically, no, Gentiles don't have to do these things. What they have to do is love God above all things, love their neighbor as their self, live lives of purity and self-sacrifice, justice, and so forth. That's what's required of them. This is what he calls it's the spirit of the law. It's the righteous requirements of the law, the dikaumata tu namu in Greek. Not the works of the law, the ergon namu, those Jewish rituals that would separate Jews from Gentiles. Of that, he says, don't have anything to do with that.
Yeah.
But love, justice, peace, patience, kindness, mercy, gentleness, self-control. Got to do those things. You don't do those things, it's on the hot seat for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, thanks so much for your call. Here's a question now from David, who just texted us. What is a suppressed saint? Is that a saint who has been decanonized?
Okay, so
about?
Not an expert in suppressed saints,
All right.
but my sense is there are those who have been venerated in Catholic life as saints, and then perhaps under historical investigation, maybe some ancient character like St. Christopher or something, it looks like maybe that was a popular legend, right? And maybe that wasn't an actual living person, and so we're not going to promote the veneration of that particular character anymore.
Okay, very good. Here's an email came in from Maria. Dr. Anders, my question is about homosexuality. Where in the Bible does it says that is okay? My daughter 6 months ago met a lady with 3 kids, moved in with her, and now they're planning their wedding. They're attending a Christian church. I guess for them this is okay. We've been praying for her to realize she is in the wrong, but maybe we haven't prayed enough. I don't know what else to do. My son and daughter don't want her and her new family around their family. They want to protect their kids from this kind of heresy. So our family is being divided. My husband doesn't want me to be around and them at all either. Any help that you could provide would be very great. That's from Maria.
Yeah, so there's nothing in Sacred Scripture that says that it's okay. On the contrary, Sacred Scripture takes exactly the contrary point of view and says that you absolutely can't do this thing. You cannot do this thing in a number of places. So, Romans chapter 1 is a classic text that talks about the disordered passions that people exhibit when they engage in sexual activity with members of the same sex, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and many other texts as well. The whole basis of the Christian sexual ethic, Jesus outlines in Matthew chapter 19 when he points to the order of nature and creation, that God created man and woman, male and female, that they might live together and bear children, be fruitful and multiply. And Jesus says that's the order of nature that God made, and we have to hold that up. Even so much so that it's not even lawful for Christians to divorce, because what God has joined together, let man not separate. And without that purity of heart that he speaks of in Matthew chapter 5, we will not see God. So Scripture is entirely against this. Not only is Scripture against it, but reason is against it, because sin is just an irrational act. That's what sin is. Sin is an irrational act. It's an act against our own good that's knowable by reason. And how do we discern our own good? Well, it doesn't take maybe it does. It doesn't take a degree in cardiology to know what the heart is for. It's for pumping blood. And it doesn't take you don't have to have a whole lot of knowledge to know what the human sexual faculty is for. It's for procreation. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a lot of sort of ancillary benefits, but that's not what they're for, right? And of course, human sexuality is not just about private physical pleasure, but it has powerful social consequences. I mean, to begin with, it's a social reality for the two people engaged in it, by definition. But it also has social consequences for the rest of the civil order, because sexuality, because of its intimate connection to procreation and children, calls forth, of necessity, institutions to protect and hallow and sanctify the dignity of parents in their own children, called the family, based on marriage. And that's not just a Catholic thing. That's kind of a universal human phenomena around the world in every civilization down through history. And to set homosexual sex up as if it were somehow equivalent morally to the sacrament of matrimony or even natural marriage is to just completely reconfigure our conception of what a human person is and the nature of his or her own and society's flourishing. And that's basically what we've done in the modern world. We've said the human being is not for anything except for his own private and autonomous pleasure. But that way ends in death. I mean, and I'm not just talking about homosexuality. I'm talking about the point of view that says, I am for nothing, and I create my own reality or my own values, that definition is nihilistic. And that'll be the destruction of ourselves and of our entire culture, which is precisely what Paul warns about in Romans chapter 1. He says that these kinds of things can become their own punishment when God hands people over to their lusts to do that which is what is unnatural. Now, the fact that is unnatural and sinful doesn't mean that we hate or despise homosexual persons any more than we hate or despise anybody who does what's irrational. We all do things that are irrational, that hurt ourselves, and that's why God gave us the sacraments of the Church, to heal our wounded natures, to enable us weak and wounded people to live in accord with our own true and eternal good.
Maria, we'll be praying for you and for your family. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
See you next time right here on Call to Communion. I'm Tom Price. You have a wonderful day. God bless.